The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organization.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
Okay, greetings everyone. Okay, I trust you can see my screen at this point. The figure that you see depicted on the left of the screen, that is a depiction of St. Paul by the artist Rembrandt van Rijn. And on the right, you see a depiction of Charles Darwin by the artist John Collier. Why these two individuals? Well, because today I'm going to be comparing the thought of Paul in conjunction with evolutionary theory, specifically looking at human origins and the natural world. Okay, so the purpose of doing this comparison is ultimately to assess the compatibility of Paul's thought, Paul's writings, with evolutionary theory with regard to human origins and the natural world. I will be arguing in the course of this presentation that there is tension between what Paul has to say about these things and what contemporary evolutionary theory says. So in the end of today's presentation, I will offer a few reflections on what Christians may do to resolve this state of tension. But without further ado, let's begin now by considering the origin of humanity from the perspective of Paul and evolutionary theory. So I think that many of you would recognize the figure over on the left. That is a depiction of Adam. If you were to ask many Christians in your churches today, where do humans come from? Most likely they would say Adam and Eve. And if you were to press them further, it would be likely that they would express an understanding of Adam as both a historical figure and again as the father of humanity. Okay, now it turns out that this understanding of Adam tracks quite well with what the Apostle Paul seems to have thought. Okay, so Paul's Adam is a historical individual. At least I would argue that Paul's Adam is a historical individual. Some scholars, however, have suggested that Paul's Adam is not really an individual, but more of a symbol, a corporate symbol for humanity. In response, I would say that this passage in Romans problematizes that symbolic understanding of Adam as a symbol, just simply representing humanity. Because here in Romans, Paul repeatedly refers to Adam as one man, and he differentiates Adam from many others, thus seeming to suggest that Paul's Adam is an individual. Now, other scholars, while recognizing that Paul's Adam is an individual, have suggested that Paul's Adam is a mythical individual. In other words, that Paul did not see Adam as historical. That opinion as well seems to me problematic in light of the fact that Paul compares or associates Adam with Moses and Jesus Christ. Now, certainly, Paul believed that Jesus Christ was a historical individual. And there's very little doubt that he thought that Moses was a historical individual as well. So, by virtue of association with historical individuals, it lends credence to the idea that Adam was a historical person in Paul's thought. To reinforce that conclusion, however, we'll have to take a look at the role of Adam in Paul's thought, which is that Adam is the father of the human race. We see an indication of that in Romans 5:14, where Paul presents Adam as the first in a line of individuals extending to Moses. We also see an indication of this role for Adam in 1 Corinthians 15:49, where Paul says that we have borne the image of the man of dust. That phrase, man of dust, is a clear reference to Adam, as verses 45 to 47 make clear. Additionally, verse 45 refers to Adam as the first man. And the language that it uses to describe Adam, as well as Christ, suggests that Paul has in mind that Adam is the original bearer of a physical body. Okay, why do I say that? Well, we go back to verse 44. In verse 44, Paul talks about pre-resurrection and post-resurrection bodies. The post-resurrection body is a spiritual body, a pneumatikos body. And the pre-resurrection body, thereby, would be a physical body, or a psychikos body. Okay, and I say physical. Some translations use natural rather than physical, but I say physical because Paul elsewhere says that this body is subject to corruption, and it is the body that contemporary believers possess prior to their resurrection. Therefore, I think physical is justified. Okay, so the terms that are used in verse 44 for a physical body and a spiritual body are the same terms that are used in verse 45 to describe Adam and Christ respectively. Adam is the first man, and then previously Paul has said that Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection. Therefore, when you read verses 44 and 45 in conjunction, they seem to say that Adam and Christ are the original bearers of a physical and a spiritual body. I think that is significant because if Adam is the original bearer of a physical body, and there are other human beings who also possess physical bodies, then it stands to reason that those other human beings have descended from Adam, who is the original bearer. Also, if Adam possesses a physical body, and other human beings who possess physical bodies descend from Adam, it stands to reason that Adam is a historical person, because other human beings with physical bodies are likewise historical, and they descend from Adam. Okay, now if you are interested in further evidence that Paul thought of Adam as the father of the human race, you can perhaps consider this verse in Acts as well. Acts 17:26 says that from one ancestor, God made all nations to inhabit the earth. Most exegetes would say that Paul has Adam in mind there. Okay, so now let's switch gears and discuss what evolution has to say, or evolutionary theory has to say regarding the origin of humanity. So according to evolutionary theory, human beings evolved from a pre-existing hominid species. What is a hominid? Well, hominids are a taxonomic family of species that includes Homo sapiens, you and me, i.e. other human beings, as well as chimpanzees, gorillas, and other extinct species such as Neanderthals. Now, some Christians do find this idea problematic, that we are all related or that we evolved from a pre-existing species. But to me, what is more problematic is this idea that humankind began with several thousand individuals in existence. In other words, contemporary evolutionary theorists believe that the first humans, which emerged about 200,000 years ago, initially numbered in the thousands. There was never a time when there was simply one or two human beings in existence. So to many Christians and theologians, that seems like a blatant contradiction of the Pauline idea that humanity is descended from Adam and Eve, two historical individuals. Recently, however, Joshua Swamidass, a Christian and a computational biologist at Washington University in the USA, he's offered a workaround for people who are interested in maintaining evolutionary theory and the biblical principle of descent from Adam and Eve. So his theory goes like this. First, he makes a distinction between two types of humans, biological and scriptural. So biological humans are products of hominid evolution, whereas scriptural humans are descendants of Adam and Eve. And Swamidas even suggests that Adam and Eve were created de novo, in other words, not the products of hominid evolution. He also suggests that Adam and Eve were created after biological human beings, i.e. products of hominid evolution, were already in existence. He bases this claim off of the Genesis narrative, but it would be prudent to make this claim as well because, again, he's trying to maintain harmony with evolutionary theory, and evolution teaches that the original population of humans numbered in the thousands. So he suggests that biological humans came first, and then scriptural humans, Adam and Eve and their descendants, came second. Okay? And then his theory further postulates that the descendants of Adam and Eve interbreed with biological humans, therefore producing humans in both senses, both biological and scriptural. So after thousands of generations of interbreeding, all human beings are both the products of hominid evolution and the descendants of Adam and Eve. Now, for the descendants of Adam and Eve to be able to interbreed with the products of hominid evolution suggests that initially Adam and Eve are very similar physically to those other biological humans already in existence. Now, what's one to make of Swamidas's theory? There's perhaps a few things that I could say, but the one observation that I want to make is that I don't think Paul would recognize Swamidas's theory as his own. Remember that previously I claimed that Paul seems to think that Adam is the original bearer of a physical human body. That seems like a strange thing to claim if he was under the impression that actually surrounding Adam and Eve were thousands of other individuals with more or less the same body plan. In other words, I think that Paul thought of Adam as a true first of its kind, not a first among more or less equivalent creatures. So therefore, though Joshua Swamidas is at pains to maintain the biological understanding of human origins and the scriptural or Pauline understanding of human origins as descent from Adam and Eve, his theory does not end up representing what Paul himself, I think, would have thought. Okay, so therefore, his theory suggests that those who are interested in maintaining a biological or evolutionary understanding of human origins must ultimately maintain some distance from what the apostle thought. Okay, I will return to that idea in the conclusion of this presentation. Now let's transition, however, to discussing the natural world in Pauline and evolutionary perspective. More specifically, I'm going to focus on the misery of the natural world. Things like death, decay, suffering from a Pauline and a evolutionary perspective. Okay, now I submit that if you were to ask most Christians, where does death, decay, suffering, and the like come from? They would point to the fall. The fall is a theological concept. It is rooted in the Genesis 3 narrative where we read that Adam and Eve, they disobeyed God's command to not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and as a result, they incurred God's judgment. So, according to popular Christian understanding, this is what pre-fall existence looked like. There you see Adam and Eve, you see a variety of animals, predator and prey, getting along together, apparently. The environment is verdant, it's full of life. But you notice that Adam and Eve are about to partake of something that, according to popular Christian understanding, leads to things like this. Okay, animal predation, a changed relationship between the animals, and this, which is death and decay and suffering. So I would submit that this popular Christian understanding for the origin of death, decay, and the like actually resonates with what the apostle himself writes in the book of Romans, specifically this passage, Romans 8, verses 19 to 22. Based on my reading various commentaries, it seems to me that the majority of contemporary Bible exegetes would say that Paul is here portraying creation Paul is here portraying creation in terms of the fall. That in other words, creation has been impacted by the fall and therefore is suffering from futility and decay. Now, this interpretation is not accepted by all contemporary exegetes, but it does seem to be the predominant one. And almost all contemporary exegetes would argue that creation here is to be understood as subhuman material creation, and that God is the agent who subjected creation to futility and decay. Now, these details actually comport quite well with Genesis 3, 17 to 18. This has traditionally been understood to be the inspiration behind Romans 8, 19 to 22. Okay, in Genesis 3, 17 to 18, God is the agent who curses the ground. The ground could be taken as a possible symbol or synecdoche for creation. And notice that the curse on the ground, it essentially boils down to this fact that the ground is no longer able to attain the original potential that it was designed to have. Okay, so this idea of the ground being cursed and it no longer being able to achieve its potential actually tracks quite well with Paul's use of the term mateotes, which is here rendered futility in the NRSV. So Cranfield, who is a noted scholar of Romans, has said that mateotes generally means the ineffectiveness of that which does not achieve its goal. So therefore, there seems to be a sort of conceptual linkage between Paul's portrayal of creation and what we find in the Genesis 3 text regarding the curse on the ground. There's also a possible linguistic connection within the book of Romans, because in Romans chapter 1, verse 21, we find the only other use of a mateos cognate. So that term that's here rendered futility, we find the only other use of a mateos cognate in Romans 1:21. Now, James Dunn, another noted New Testament scholar, has argued that Romans 1:21 appears in the middle of a section that alludes to the fall of Adam. Okay, so that would further strengthen the idea that what Paul is presenting here is creation as a consequence of the fall. Now, there are several other indications that I'm afraid we don't have time to look into, but I do present it in my paper, as to connections between this passage and Genesis 3, which would further support the idea that this passage is depicting a fallen creation. The most important term, however, from this passage for us to consider is this one. You can see bolded on your screen. Okay, so the NRSV translates thora as decay. And I think that's a reasonable translation of this Greek term. That term thora can mean moral corruption or evil, but it can also mean death, decay, perishability. And in fact, Paul's other uses of the noun in Galatians 6:8 and 1 Corinthians 15, they comport with this idea of death and its related physical processes generally. Further, if Paul did mean thora in the sense of death or decay, it would comport quite well with what we find in a previous passage. Okay, previously, Paul has said in Romans 5, death exercised dominion. That is similar to this idea that creation is in bondage to thora if thora means death. Okay, the imagery is quite similar there. And I think that this is not a coincidence. I think that there is a real linkage, and possibly even an intentional linkage, because we come back to Romans 8:19 to 22, and we find that many of the ways that Paul presents fallen creation would also apply to fallen humanity as well. Okay, for instance, Paul presents the creation groaning in labor pains, but that's also true of Eve as a consequence of the fall. That term mateotes that I mentioned earlier refers to creation here in this passage, but previously Paul has indicated that it applies to fallen humanity in Romans chapter 1. Okay, you could also make a case that hope is one of the characteristics of humanity in its fallen state. Here it's projected as a characteristic of fallen creation. So if we take all of these terms for fallen creation and the fact that similar terms would apply to fallen humanity, what Paul seems to be implying here, is that there's a solidarity in terms of humanity and creation in its fallenness. And therefore, we are to expect that how Paul refers to fallen humanity would apply to fallen creation as well. So coming back now to Romans 5, chapter 12 to 21, Paul is explicit. Death came into the world through one man, Adam. This passage is explicitly about humanity, but again, the solidarity that humanity has with creation suggests that creation is also experiencing death, that death came into the created order as a result of Adam's sin. So when you read Romans 5, 12 to 21 in conjunction with Romans 8, 19 to 22, the deduction is this: physical death and decay are the consequences of Adam's transgression for all, for humanity as well as for subhuman material creation. Okay, now what does this have to do with dinosaurs? Well, if you believe if you believe in evolutionary theory, or even if you don't, if you believe that the earth is old, then you believe that innumerable creatures have come and gone prior to the advent of humanity and its first sin. In other words, death was a feature of the world before humanity first sinned. So now let's think back to what Paul has said, that humanity, that Adam in particular, is responsible for the entrance of death into the world. Can it be that the effect, death, precedes the cause, sin? Okay, someone who has answered affirmatively yes is this man, William Dembski. Okay, William Dembski is an intelligent design theorist. He's a notable proponent of intelligent design, which means that he does not support conventional evolutionary theory. But nonetheless, he does believe that the earth is old, approximately 4.5 billion years old, and he believes that death existed prior to humanity, but he also believes, based on his understanding of Scripture, his commitment to scriptural inerrancy, that humanity's transgression, that the fall is responsible for all death and natural evil, that it is responsible for death both post-fall and pre-fall. So how does he argue this? He says that God foresaw the fall and punished creation prior to the event taking place. So is this an acceptable theory? Maybe to some. Some may indeed find this to be an acceptable harmonization of science and scripture. But I note that in order to accept Dembski's position, you do have to accept the idea that the effect can precede the cause, or to put it differently, that the punishment can precede the crime. Okay, so that is a difficult thing to accept both logically and morally. And in addition, I would submit that it's not at all clear that Paul had this understanding in mind. One can certainly read Romans chapter 5 and Romans chapter 8 as saying that prior to Adam's transgression, death was absent. And hence Dembski's view may not be a true harmonization of science and what the scripture says. Okay, now there's a further issue regarding this idea of sin resulting in death, because from the evolutionist perspective, death is an integral part of species evolution. Consider now this quote from John Bimson, who is a Christian theologian, by the way. He says this: "A non-predatory, herbivorous lion would need a different digestive system, different teeth, a different kind of jaw structure, a different musculature and overall anatomy. In short, it would cease to be a lion in any meaningful sense." What he is effectively saying here is that a lion is what it is because it can kill. That if lions were not able to kill, if killing was not permitted, if death was not permitted, we would not have lions. Okay, now a lion is a predator, and predators, as well as other life-depriving entities such as viruses, bacteria, parasites, they all contribute to this mechanism of natural selection, according to evolutionary theory, which is responsible for the development of all creatures. Okay, so to express this point, Holmes Ralston III, a Christian philosopher, has made this memorable quote. He says, "The cougar's fang has carved the limbs of the fleet-footed deer." In other words, you wouldn't have deer without cougars, and you wouldn't have cougars without death. Death is an integral part of species evolution, according to evolutionary theory. Now, that may seem reasonable on its own, and the idea that death results from sin may seem reasonable on its own. But when you put both together, then you seem to have a problem, because then it seems to be that you are saying that sin results in the tremendous biodiversity that we have today. That sin is responsible for lions and tigers and bears and whales and butterflies and the like. And that is a problematic thing to exceed. Okay? So what I am saying is that there does indeed seem to be tension between what Paul, the apostle, has stated in Romans 5 and 8 and elsewhere, if we're talking about human origins. And there's tension between what the apostle Paul has stated and what evolutionary theory currently accepts. So what's a Christian to do? One possibility would be to deny evolution to some degree. That would thereby create room for you to accept Paul's thought in full. Another possibility is to accept evolution in full, but deny Paul's thought to some degree. Or to put it differently, to maintain a degree of separation between what you believe and what the apostle has said. I personally would put the proposals of Swamidas and Dembski in this second category, though I do not think that they are conscious themselves of differing from Paul's stance. If we go by the exegesis that I have taken us through, then it does seem that their proposals do not fully track with Paul. However, I noted that Swamidas and Dembski are at pains to approve of this idea of a historical Adam and death resulting from a fall, which are two pillars of Paul's thought. But several other theologians these days have dispensed with those beliefs altogether because of their seeming contradiction with evolutionary theory. And I just mentioned some of them, or I'll show some of them here on your screen. Okay, so several theologians, this is not the full number, have dispensed with the idea of a historical Adam and death resulting from the fall. Do these theologians just close their eyes when they get to Romans 5 or Romans 8? Have they cut those passages out of their Bible? What do these theologians do when they come to texts like that? In fact, several of these theologians, those who are at least conscious of their own viewpoint differing from the apostle, continue to find relevance in some of the problematic passages in Romans and 1 Corinthians. They deduce meaning from those passages without going all the way to affirm everything that Paul seemed to be saying, including a historical Adam and death from the fall. Practically speaking, they adopt a message incident principle, when it comes to Scripture. This term has been used by Denis Lamoureux. He says that Scripture contains eternal, universal truths that are sometimes couched in contextual ideology that is no longer reasonable to support. To put it metaphorically, Scripture contains both meat and bones, the bones being that contextual ideology. So metaphorically speaking, the bones provide some structure for the meat, but only the meat is fit for consumption. That's the message incident principle. Now, to be perfectly honest, I don't think all Christians will be happy with the message incident principle. In fact, I think that for many, the idea that Paul could have been wrong about a historical Adam or death resulting from the fall would be seen as anathema. So long as Christians maintain stringent understandings of scriptural inerrancy, then opposition to evolutionary theory is likely to endure. However, for those who find the science of evolution compelling, then the message incident principle may offer the best possible recourse to handling difficult passages of Scripture. Ultimately, evolution is a consequential issue for Christians. Depending on one's views of evolution, it affects how one approaches the Scripture, what one believes. For those who find evolution compelling, it offers a bulwark against certain theological beliefs, such as death resulting from the fall. But it may also offer a resource for approving or engendering other theological beliefs. Take, for instance, the theodicy problem. Someone who is an evolutionary creationist might argue that God permits death and suffering and decay because without such, we would not have the incredible biodiversity that we see in our world today. So evolution could be seen by some to offer an asset. It's a helpful asset for doing theology. But for others, evolution will seem like a harmful distraction from the true teachings of Scripture. Which one is it? Ultimately, that's not for me to say, but for you to decide. Thank you.